You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production. You'll be learning key insights for vertical farming success from leading industry operators, growers, and executives. If you're a grower or owner looking to optimize your existing or new indoor cultivation facility, or anyone looking to cultivate more in less space, we've got you covered. Cultivation Elevated, sponsored by Pipp Horticulture.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Cultivation Elevated, sponsored by Pipp Horticulture. I'm your host, Michael Williamson, and we're here today in Austin, Texas, and I'm with Jesse Porter, Director of Cultivation and Content for GrowGlide.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be here,
Hey,
man.
It's good. It's always good to see you. And on behalf of the Pipp family, welcome to the Pipp family.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. It's nice to have these, new resources and access to the team, and it's fun to be able to share knowledge and chat with you openly, and I think it's great, man.
Yeah, it's a 1 + 1 = 3. The acquisition is interesting because it's one of the first times that, Pipp has been acquiring other companies in the space, and they typically have been like complementary to their offerings. If you look at like greenhouse and vertical air, but here's the first time that they've made an acquisition of a competitor.
Yeah, I think, historically, Pipp has made some really powerful decisions in trying to convey intimacy into this market and really understand it. And that's why I think it's fun to have a voice in a bigger community with more manufacturing power and more ability to serve the market. I think there's a lot of benefits that the whole community gets to see while we still push innovation and challenge each other and argue behind closed doors about the best way to do it. I think that's all good.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking earlier that, it depends on your perspective of competition. Like, I've always been really pro, positive competition. Like, I want to outdo my best competitor because there's a lot of room to elevate in this space. And if you don't have someone to compete with, unless you're, like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant, you're just out there, battling yourself, you can get a little bit stagnant. So I look at healthy competition as the catalyst for innovation and creativity.
Sure. And I look at it as a support network, right? Like, whatever happens in the space, we both know mechanical systems fail, challenges come up. There's always a way to overcome it if you have good enough people in the room throwing good ideas at it. And I think that's, again, one of the bigger benefits of the team being able to come together is let's all throw good ideas at each other's problems, at the community's problems, at this cultivator's problem that we have this long-standing relationship with. So there's this great opportunity to pull from each other and each other's experiences and serve the industry faster and better and help them make more money.
Yeah, strength and unity. It's a real thing. And at the end of the day, our new relationship benefits the end customer the most. And I think that's the most important thing. It seems like different, whether they're vendors that service to the industry or even people in the industry, sometimes they forget about the end customer, or they don't put the end customer at the center of everything that they do.
Right. And I think sometimes it's a lack of communication. Sometimes it's a lack of resources. Sometimes it's just, not really understanding what the problems are. And I think with the breadth of projects that we've all done now, there's so many different ways to solve a problem. Now in a matter of minutes, you're going to get 5 really well-experienced opinions on that.
Sure. For anyone that's been living under a rock and doesn't know who GrowGlide is, can you tell me a little bit about and tell our listeners about, the company and the solutions?
Yeah. I mean, GrowGlide has been in the industry since 2017, 2018, but realistically it's about Darren's journey in the cannabis market trying to find success, right? Darren Seipels, the president of GrowGlide, was a cultivator in Southern California, and the market continued to grow and compress like we all saw. And his reaction was, how do I take advantage of this opportunity to help myself, help my cultivation partners, be more efficient, grow more weed, and do it cheaper? And that allowed them to survive compression in the early stages. And as a result, there's R&D fast and furious. How do we solve this problem? Get more out of this room, do more with less. And that sort of gave the rise to Darren really developing the solution that he did, augmenting it with AirGlide, really perfecting drainage, really thinking about the little things like, how's the plumbing going to work? And how How much time is it going to take to install this? Can we shave that down, take away some of the pain of this whole experience that we went through? And I think the result is, a purpose-built solution with purpose-built support, right? We say by growers, for growers, but at this point, it's science applied to business with measurable success.
Nice. It's interesting because once we started seeing competition pop up in the vertical farming space, it was like, making other, rackings or, these retail racking guys who are converting over stuff. It was like, hey, wait a minute, there might be some real legs in the racking space in this multi-tiered kind of venture. In the earliest days of Greenhouse Industries, before we were acquired by Pipp, we were hitting trade shows 2012, 13, and we had racking and multi-tiered, and we had fluorescent lights, right? We had T5s. And boy, the community was not super receptive. It was a slow thing. And little by little, people would undersize their bedrooms and be like, hey, I have a problem. I can't keep capacity in my flower, or I have to veg in place in flower, which, as you know, there's a big cost when you're vegging in a flower room.
Sure. Cycle time.
Yeah, big time. And so, we started kind of filling in these little niche markets. But then, fast forward, it's crazy to say it's been 10 years. And now look at the level of product and development and innovation and creativity. I mean, it might be one of the biggest game-changing things in the cannabis space in quite a while. It's that and probably integrated HVAC.
Yeah, I think we talk about this tech that drives both non-cannabis agriculture and cannabis agriculture, right? Like, what tech do you invest in that helps you make more money? And fundamentally, like, lights weren't really keeping up with a multi-tier indoor grow environment, right? And now we have commercial LEDs that, if you understand how to optimize that tool, allow you to take advantage of 2, even 3 tiers in the case of some of our partners like Three Flamingos in Long Beach, right? These people have 3 tiers of cultivation. They need a tremendous veg. Is 3 tiers even enough in veg for something like that if you have a cull rate of 10%? So multi-tier veg, multi-tier mom, triple tier flower. How do you support that? How do you make money off of it? And I think in a lot of ways, what they found is that their room utilization at that 3-tier environment allowed them to drive a cost of production that allowed them to survive any market compression. So even if in the future holds $700-$800 a pound, they're still going to be okay because they're built to optimize the whole facility, optimize the lights, optimize fertigation. It took trial and error, but once they figured it out, those trackable metrics pencil out year in, year out.
Not to say there's not an upfront cost associated with packing in all that transpiration and the lighting and all that stuff. But when you look at the metrics, especially in a place like California, Long Beach, what an incredible spot too.
Expensive to operate there.
Expensive real estate. So you have to maximize every cubic inch, right? And so, but when you start to look at the metrics, I mean, I guess what kind of, like, from being a longtime grower in California like yourself, where do you, in single tier HPS, where do you see like the best players? Like, what do those numbers look like in terms of grams per square foot?
Yeah, I think it's obviously somewhat not fair, right? Because you can overload your veg, you can grow bigger veg, and ultimately you'll have like these larger plants that cost you time when we think about cycle time in this larger facility. But if you play that game and you get that buildup, I see people getting 95, 100 grams a square foot in single tier HPS. These massive plants and the time you have to wait, and that compromise means that there's this knowledge transition. Like, go from the set points and senescence techniques and airflow tools that you were applying there to get 100 grams a square foot and transition it into multi-tier, airflow limited. Where is the supply return configuration going to be? Like real math, real computational fluid dynamics. And guys like me that spent my whole career in cultivation, I didn't have time to learn psychrometrics or thermodynamics. So the conversations were remedial at best when I would ask my engineer for support. And this huge disconnect is, I think, in one ways, what leads to the bigger challenges of multi-tier, right? Like, how do you control leaf temperature? How do you mitigate the microclimates? How do you get airflow through a facility that's jam-packed at 80% cubic room utilization? Right? It's a lot of material in there. But overcoming those obstacles, I think through phasing, right? Build one, Learn how to use it, learn how to run it, lean into the partners that you invested into. Talk to your lighting company. Understand how to use that tool. Talk to your racking company. Reach out to your fertigation company, your nutrient company. Fine tune. That's where I think the money's to be made in these commercial facilities, right? Go up, use the space, especially if it's expensive, and you'll make your money back faster. But you just have to build the SOPs, which is the challenge.
So 100 grams a square foot on, like, and I would agree, and I've even seen a little higher in some cases. The one note that I always like to peg there is they're growing a 7-foot tall plant
100%
on a rolling bench typically. And so now you have like a 9-foot plant, and what are you working on typically? Step ladders and ladders. And so, when single tier growers give me grief over a multi-tier and the workflow, and I'm like, you're on a ladder.
Yeah.
Now we're on platforms,
Right.
We're on walkways that are secure and safe.
You could clip in though.
Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting to watch the innovation. So now with GrowGlide customers, where do you see the best yields on multi-tiered LED?
We have customers measurably getting 85 grams a square foot in their facility. They test all over the range from 44% THC at 12% moisture content.
That's outrageous.
Isn't it? And I used to call BS on that.
What cut is it? What is this magic flower?
Yeah. So the 44% that I saw most recently was on an old school cut of J1, believe it or not.
Which is what, Jack?
Yeah, it just came up out of nowhere, Southern California cuts, and people have been running it, but it just sort of resurfaced, and then it's got that, train wrecky kind of.
Sure, it's a very unique terpene profile.
Right, and that just blew up THC, and then you've got a cut like Cuban Links, which, I have a friend growing that's testing above 5% terps.
It's that Cuban Black Haze something, right?
Cross, yeah. But then the thing is
is that Swamp Boys?
I'm not sure where that came from, and maybe I probably shouldn't.
Oh, gotcha.
But
people name stuff all the time,
Sure, and rename stuff. That's part of the game that I played when I was coming up, right? Like I had a hydro shop, but then I had this clone operation behind it, and I would support Harborside by delivering clones, and it became this game of they're going to order 5,000 cuts of sour, and I only have 2,500. I wonder if this clementine would suffice.
Sure.
Not selling it to a commercial grow. I'm selling it to a place that's going to resell it as retail. And all the reviews were like, this is fire, this is great. But that came me up early on into the strain game and how I really feel about it.
What year were you a hydro shop owner and nursery owner?
So 2015 was the heyday of when I was moving product, solutions product, but simultaneously sort of selling clones and developing my seed company and developing my industry knowledge. And, that hydro shop, which was perfectly positioned behind Harborside, was the best opportunity I ever had in this space because I sold people product that I believed in and had to support it. And it was like the difference between selling a commodity and becoming a trusted entity to that person.
It's a lot different when your office is 500 miles away and you actually never really see your customers, and maybe you got to deal with a phone call.
7 days
email.
a week, my shop was open. We'd be smoking out front. You can come find me.
You never knew who was going to walk through the front door, I'm sure.
Never. And then you started supporting bigger and bigger growers and had bigger and bigger failures.
I personally have never experienced anything. When I moved to Santa Cruz and started working up in the Bay Area, and it was like, oh, I got to go to the hydro shop, and there was they were everywhere, and I had never seen that much volume. I mean, it was just coming from someone who grew up in Florida, which was very much a police state growing up, being a cannabis user. There was a whole different fear, and then coming to the West Coast was like, wow, it is this wide open. And so it was such a culture shock for me, and I was like, how many growers are in this state? And I don't remember the numbers now, but California grower count, which I know is probably dropping currently to some extent.
Which market are we talking about?
I would say commercially. But yeah, I just have never experienced anything like, and you were born and raised whereabouts?
Southern California.
Okay.
Then went up to Northern California to go to school at Cal. That's where mom got sick with cancer, and then got out, chased a bunch of different things, including professor at Oaksterdam University, and ran facilities. But that hydro shop, again, was like a jumping off point to other aha moments in the space, right? I was brewing tea, compost tea there, studied with Dr. Elaine Ingham, just trying to add value to my shop when I'm there and help support people, selling books, Lowenfels books, telling people to bring weed in and we put it under the microscope live and talk through 80% relevant pest identification and, you know, analyzing the quality and stuff like that. But then I got to this point where I realized that I was surviving in a really crowded and competitive hydro shop market because I had used my brain and started brewing tea and having a different conversation than other people weren't. But no one had that skill set at that point. I was just trying to game myself up to differentiate myself in the market. And that aha moment was, this is valuable. I should invest more into learning more things about cannabis. And that's what to this day still drives me, right? Like I want to learn as much as I can, but I also want it to apply to business success because that was the mantra and the path that I took at my hydro shop. How do I just use my brain to support these people to help them make more money? More quality, more quantity, more consistency, understand all this other stuff I'm trying to figure out in a way that's consumable. So it's almost like take the science and the data, apply it to businesses, see if it works, and if it does, build on it. And that mantra is exactly what I go into facilities with to this day. It's like, how can I make you more money tomorrow than today? What can you do right now? What bottleneck can we solve within 24 hours? It's those little things, and you check enough of those off, and that's how you get operational efficiency. And for me, that's how I learned, was like trying to help other people make a lot of money is exactly what gave me bigger opportunities in this space.
You know, one of the purposes of this podcast is to give people an authentic tone and perspective from customers, vendors, and players in this space. Can you give some examples of some of the like low-hanging fruit stuff that's like, I can help this grow tomorrow if they do this one thing? And a lot of times these are things that don't cost any money, which is always the beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think, you know, I always try to think about that ROI, because if I go in and say, hey, I think rerouting your ductwork, changing your supply return configurations, putting in an open air mixing plenum and using integrated HVAC, people are like, dude, I don't have the budget for that. Baby step me until I can invest in that. What I usually say is like, you know, what metrics and KPIs are important to you? That's my first question out the gate all the time. Like, what kind of business do you run? Is this fresh frozen extraction? Is this high grade flower? Is it mids for pre-rolls? Like, what are the goals on each of these rooms? And then we can really dial it in. And I think that opportunity is like, okay, you know, if it's a cultivation spot, and this is almost getting tired at this point, but an emissivity adjusted IR gun, the ability to teach someone how to use that tool. Like people throw it around. I want to use VPD as a tool.
For people who might not be familiar with that tool, can you tell them a bit more about what that's about?
Sure. And I think...
And say it again for me, because I didn't quite catch it.
An emissivity adjustable IR gun. So infrared gun, we're sort of familiar in this space as a cultivator, right? Shoot stuff and figure out how hot or cold it is. Now that we're starting to have these high-level crop steering conversations about environmental control, drybacks, transpiration, PFD, managing all these different things, that IR gun has helped me make my friends, family, colleagues, and peers more money than any other tool in the space. Because when you adjust it appropriately, you get the right leaf temperature, right? It typically comes to hit concrete or brick or whatever it is.
Right, you hit concrete first.
It's
and
like 0.95 emissivity. If you adjust to 0.97, which is a relatively agreed upon number at this point, you get a more accurate reading. And the readings of those two emissivities are 6 to 11 degrees apart on average. So it's dramatic. Why does all this matter, right? The point is that you're assessing plant health, like Fluence, right? Fluence is great at research and came out with this 78 to 82 degree plant leaf temperatures optimal for photosynthesis. Okay, well, that's what we're trying to drive here. So why not shoot for that? What it means is instead of like looking at your wall mount hygrometer and saying, I think the temperature and humidity is right, you test the leaf temperature and you adjust it as this plant grows. So you're always in this optimal growth position. And then you can adjust your HVAC system. So the big benefit of transitioning from LED or HID to LED isn't, okay, we have less heat. It's that there's a smaller offset. So we can run way warmer conditions in the room and still get really good plant health. So now we have this HVAC system that's tired and we're trying to retrofit. We can swap out the lights and we get a benefit because there's less heat in the room. There's less sensible. But then at the same time, we're just able to get more out of that unit because we're going to run it at a warmer condition. That's what HVAC taught me in this space, is like figure out the warmest condition you're comfortable with and it'll be the most efficient.
Efficiently, right?
It'll do the most work for the least amount of energy at that condition. So that offset's tremendous, which brings us back to racking. And early on in the process, you really need to understand your tier-to-tier spacing. It's relative to PFD and what you're trying to do from a cultivation perspective. So set yourself up for success early on with the lights that you're going to use or the lights you think you might use in the future. Give yourself enough room, but optimize it. Because if you take an additional 6 inches or 8 inches on every upright, on every row, in every room you build, it starts to add up. And you're not optimizing the photons.
Inches matter in the vertical farming space for 100%.
Sure. 100% penetration. We were just talking about inner canopy lighting and some of these other augmented techniques, and usually a byproduct of not effectively maintaining plant management through veg. Should you have just grown shorter plants that would be more effectively served by a lower wattage light? Would that be a better play? Maybe.
What are some of the we talked a little bit about some challenges that we see in the vertical farming space, but again, it's not the racking's fault. It's not the lighting's fault. It's typically an issue of design and engineering, typically. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh man, I don't want to keep digging this hole and calling out engineers in the space, because that game is changing too. Like, you talk to more and more engineers and they're really figuring it out and getting on the same page with supply return configuration and how much, performance need you really need from sensible and latent. But I think it's also, there's a disconnect. CFOs are talking EBITDA and cultivators are talking BPD and engineers are talking thermodynamics, right? So it's 3 different languages, but you get on the same language of what KPIs and metrics are we trying to invest in to control, well, then it boils down a lot quicker. That cultivator knows what tools they're actually going to use, what they want to collect, and what will impact their bottom line, right? Grams per square foot, COAs, price per pound, like these other metrics, so they can have that conversation early on of saying, like, let's cut that corner, but this one's really important. I can do without that if I have effective controls or ability to get the data.
You said something that kind of hit with me. It's like, I refer to it as like a CFO design grow versus a cultivator design grow facility. And it's like, how much racking can I shove and stick and fit in this room? And it's like, long story short, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, some of those challenges that you see during the design process in terms of, seeing facilities and saying, hey, you guys really need a little bit more buffer space around this cube, and then getting that pushback of like, no, this is like, we got to do this because we need this much canopy because this is what we guaranteed to our investors, and then you sit there and go, well, actually, I could guarantee you could probably get the yield metrics with less physical canopy if you don't choke this room.
I think where I see that so often is, in our customer journey, right? We come in and one of the first things we're asking, which is distance off the back wall, distance off the front wall, tier spacing, mobile aisle, the basic stuff, what else is in the room, is also like, what do you want to chase? Workflow, efficiency, or optimized yields? Do you want 5-foot wide tables because we can squeeze in another 800 square feet into these rooms? Or would you prefer we have better airflow spacing on the sides so you can add additional half fans because you don't think that the air balancing from the HVAC is going to be enough, right? So trying to figure out how to balance those things, we try to really early on in the process just educate the customer on where their power lies, what variables they have control of, and how that has a ripple effect through the rest of the decision-making process. Now you need this many more lights, or in the case of 5-foot lights, like maybe that's more efficient, less drivetrain, less drive box, less lights for the same amount of canopy, if not more. Is it as efficient? Like that chase is hard because every cultivator has to answer to a team. So it becomes, shouldn't we just add more canopy? And then that chase leads to, we're not going to have enough power for the HVAC. Now we're not going to be able to raise enough money. Let's go back here and refigure So I always say, try and pursue multiple avenues of like, choose the how much canopy can we smash into this room perspective, so you got a number, and then choose the one that's optimized for workflow and everything else you plan on doing in that space when you're going to defull. Really think it through, see what the delta is, and see if it's worth it.
It's almost like there should be like an if-then clause where it's like, if you cram all these canopies or there's all this racking in here, then you will potentially have...
Turn to page 37.
Yeah.
These 7 things.
Yeah. But to come back to Three Flamingos for a moment. So earlier we talked about a single tiered, high performing cultivators, let's say 100 grams a square foot. And we got high performing multi-tier under LED at 85 grams a square foot. So, on a double tier, I mean, it's really hard to, I really struggle to put my head in, and I try to like put my mind in the mindset of, I gotta say it differently, but we'll edit that. Sometimes when I try and like put on the single tier HPS grower's hat, if it's budget and you have like ample space and it's already there, sure. Okay. And it's familiar and you're confident and you need to be consistent and this is where you're comfortable. I look at a lot of this new technology and I'm like, who's the grower and what's their comfort level? What's their experience level with this stuff? Because that can dictate equipment decisions and, like going 3 tiers in flower. Hopefully you've gone 2 tiers in flower at least and crushed that and been like, I'm ready. I can take it to the next level. But when you look at it from a yield metric, what is that? 170 grams a square foot, 2 tiers.
Yeah. I mean, you look at
versus
it
100.
Look at it from an asset perspective. Like that asset is worth more per square foot because it's producing more per square foot. So as you go look for borrowing capital or you look to exit in the future, like that's a big deal. Like you're doing a lot more with a lot less. And as a result, you're more profitable if you do it right and manage it appropriately. It's scalable into any market. And again, it's more worthwhile your investment as an entrepreneur.
And then you look at the metric on 3-tier flower, and I can't do that math really quickly, but was that 250 grams? I mean, a square foot. So how can you say that HPS yields, if we're talking grams per, square foot, that's a little bit different, but like, it's hard to argue because of the amount of increased yield and value there is just, it's not a little bit, it's monstrous.
We try to do the math all the time on room utilization, right? Like we have a room generator tool where you can take your space and you can plug in a single tier and you're like, hey, single tier square footage only, like we're at 70-75% room utilization. Pretty standard, pretty solid. I don't think you add that second tier and you get to 125 like some of the common metrics. I actually think that first number is skewed. It's more like 25% of the room because you're not using the cubic space, right? We can get to that 70 and 80% using the cubic footage in the space. Now we have a real operational efficiency metric where CFOs can be like, I can't go above 75. Like that's what all these cultivation facilities that are having success in multi-tier are doing. Like you need to have these extra areas for airflow, but that's a metric that's skewed because people want to say, oh, 125% room utilization. Is it though? Let's talk about that airspace,
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, where people are like, oh, I've got 16-foot, or let's say I'll go less. Like I got 15-foot ceiling, so I'm going to go with a 14-foot tall rack. And you're like, no, you're not. Like, where's your HVAC distribution live and exist?
Right.
And a lot of people, you highlighted earlier, it's like serviceability. It's like if your main aisle is 3 feet and some change, like that's going to be a pretty rough workflow. And there's something, when I do these podcasts and I do them with like active clients and growers, morale comes up quite a bit. Right. And so and there's been different, themes over the years that I've seen, but like when people transition from, as an example, a single tiered HPS room and they get their first like retrofit of a double tiered LED room, even whatever haters are in the building, it doesn't matter because it's new and it's a new challenge for them. And overall, I'd say most people, even though they're maybe slightly intimidated, they're really excited because it's something new. And, in cannabis, especially in production, you are a machine, and it does get that, autonomy syndrome thing is kind of real.
It's a career opportunity for a lot of people. Learning how to work on a multi-tier cultivation facility is a skill set that's highly sought after, right? And if you didn't take that risk and you didn't learn how to do it, then that skill set's dying off. just like running 3-part or some of the old techniques that just got passed on, right? Like gaming yourself up about the technology and how to use it is exactly what's going to keep you viable in this industry and give you job security, whether you're lead cultivator or a trimmer, right? Like figure out how to use the tools. And I think that's one of the, missed opportunities here, is that there's fear, there's trepidation, there's capital limitations, but there's success out there too. And if you chase that success and really understand why those facilities have been successful and what metrics they value, you can mimic that. Maybe you don't buy the same exact stuff, but like mimic that. It's working.
What boxes would you say you need to check to grow good weed in the cannabis, in the multi-tiered cannabis space?
I mean, my heart says you got to start with good genetics, and you got to know those genetics, right? Once you know the genetics, you know what to expect from a yield perspective, a COA perspective, a consistent bag appeal perspective. It lets you put post-harvest processing into play. It lets you master curing. Those things are all a byproduct of phenotypic expression and plant morphology that you control too with the environment you build. That becomes your biggest limiting factor, is your ability to control airflow, temperature, and humidity in these multi-tier environments. So once you know your genetics and you know how you're going to steer them and what environmental itineraries you want to set up, you can get that predictable success. You can still leave yourself wiggle room to bring in new genetics, but they'll take a little bit of time to fine tune before they get to that 85 grams a square foot, sub 400 cost of production metric that makes you feel like you're winning and everyone's going to get a Christmas bonus. I think that, to me, those are like driving challenges in the space that people are still trying to solve. And certain brands get away with branding and other things that allow them to survive, but they're also vesting into understanding how to use the tool.
As a legacy cannabis grower, it's got to be fascinating to watch the pound price and the fluctuation. And, I've never personally experienced such volatility in pricing as I did as a grower in California. I remember calling my wife one day after work and I was like, honey, we're not going to stay here long. Like you start doing some math in California specifically on production and sales. And it's like, wait a minute, like the oversupply has been happening for a long time and it's seemingly getting worse in some cases.
I think that's where, again, like the elevated skill set did you adapt with this industry? Because I always used to say quality, quantity, and consistency, right? Like that'll build a brand. You have some good product, you have enough of it to share, and you do it consistently. Well, then they'll recognize your brand and continue to purchase it, even if you're a black market grower, right? What separates the successful commercial operators from distressed assets is that operational efficiency play. Like, can you actually do it cheaply enough? And people that come from the black market, maybe they don't have a certain skill set that's desirable for that role. Their ability to make money with minimal inputs becomes powerful, right? Like we talked about labor. Labor will kill you in this space. But if you have good SOPs and good people, you don't have that morale drop and huge turnover that leads to, again, training every week on people how to take cuttings. Instead, you have people mastering this space with career opportunities. They're like, I was a trimmer and then I did post-harvest processing and I mastered these machines. I learned how to use these automation controls and these systems, and I've used these lights and these racks. That familiarity is what lets you sort of shortcut some of that process.
So you were touching base on like basically that survival is like a lean principle approach is going to be critical for survival for a lot of people. They didn't have a good understanding of what their true cost of goods
it didn't matter. You could produce for $2,000 a pound.
There
and
was
sell
so
for
much,
$5,000.
there was so much fluff on the top. It didn't matter. But, my rationale as an operator when I've gone into operations is like, I'm aware that the leaner I am, the more profitable I am. And so ultimately my goal, if I can get in early enough, which I've had some good opportunities early in Colorado. I feel like I was super late to California, but hopefully early in Florida here soon. If you can get in early and you can get down to $350 a pound out the door and reap the benefit, it's going to drop. It seems like the people that get caught with their pants down is they're probably producing for they think they're producing for 600 to 800 and they find out when they really do the math, it's like
7, 8.
Or 12 or 13
Sure.
I've seen, and they're just like, oh my God, I had no idea.
I wasn't factoring in all these things.
Packaging, post-harvest labor seems to be an area where I see a lot of degradation and trichome destruction, but also like just a lot of what I would describe as devalue adding touches, and not thinking about the end user. But for your sake, you have a really interesting personal history, and I'm probably going to say it wrong, but that I feel correlates really well to what cultivators how they need to prepare for the future. But one of your passions is ultra light backpacking or hiking?
Yeah, definitely, man.
Did I say that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Ultralight backpacking.
All right. So I'm a little bit familiar with the ultra community from a couple patients that we had at Kind Love. But can you tell our guests a little bit about kind of what that is, and then how you started from an equipment and support standpoint and where you got to?
Yeah. There's a lot of relevance there, mainly too, because I got into ultralight backpacking in 2009 when I was like, I'm going to walk away from the cannabis industry. I made some money. I'm out. Right. And I walked the Pacific Crest Trail.
And how long is that?
It's like 2,700 some odd miles.
And how many months did that take you?
Almost 4.
Wow.
So,
which is fast, right?
Pretty quick. The first time I tried to hike it, I had a 50-pound pack and I hiked 22 miles and just died at Lake Morena. And I was like, I quit. Come pick me up. And then I trained for a year, like mentally, physically, did research, figured it out, bought good gear, knew what I needed. And then I started flying like 10-pound pack. The idea being that I would assess the weather like you would the market as a cannabis cultivator. Say, this is all I need to get to the next spot. I'm not going to bring anything I don't, but I'm going to have exactly what I need, and I'm going to run in on empty. And then the margins are high, the wins are big, and the ease and the nimble nature in what you can do. Like the free capital is always laying around for the emergency situation because you haven't brought all this extra stuff.
Extra baggage. And we see a lot of extra stuff in these cultivation rooms, especially for new cultivators who go to, the world famous MJ BizCon, and they get excited and they get sold on by all these various vendors. And we're seeing vendors leave the space, not able to survive, and they're kind of like exciting and new. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, where did they go? But there's people that just basically buy conflicting equipment. I'm sure you saw that on the HVAC side quite a bit with different thermal energies. And you're trying to balance something. We have everything fighting itself.
Sure.
Throwing everything out of homeostasis.
I think, fear makes you do a lot of weird stuff with your money, and not understanding what you've invested in is a challenge, right? Like snake oil has been a part of this thing since I had a hydro shop, and it's like, hey, look, increase your yield by 115%, add silica, and you're like, whatever, right? So I think we're at this point now where it's science-backed decision-making, right? It's about taking case studies that close the loop on financial performance and risk reduction and seeing if these techniques and technologies actually pan out. Don't just go buy the next shiny new thing. Like, make sure you know how to use the thing that you have. Run the thing that you have into the ground. And then when that thing's broken, you'll know why you're buying the new thing.
Well, unnecessary equipment, like you started hiking with a 50-pound pack. And I used to backpack as a kid, nothing fast like you were doing, but 50. And I started the same way. Every year I'd go back to go backpacking. My backpack that I would purchase would get smaller and smaller and you saw me arrive and you were like, that's all you have? And I'm like, this is it.
The adage I like to tell, right, for ultralight backpacking advice is the heaviest thing in your pack will always be fear.
Nice.
If you're afraid to read the weather and you put in 3 extra pairs of socks, what are you doing? Wash the pair of socks in the river when you get to the checkpoint, right? So fear will weigh you down. It will make you hesitate, lose market opportunity, not get what you need at the right time.
Very applicable to cannabis.
It's crazy.
Running with that lean principle mentality, just what you need when you need it, just in time kind of, delivery, so to speak.
But to satisfy CFOs, it's like, well, it's, what was a 4-phase plan is now like 1 phase. And then projects go sideways really quick.
I like that you bring that up because I try and, when I have a platform to do so, I try and speak and say on full phase projects where there's no phasing whatsoever. And I'm like, gosh, this is a pretty big facility. You're trying to turn all these lights on at once. That's a lot. And also from a design standpoint, I don't know how many facilities that we've collectively between Pipp and GrowGlide and us personally, all the Grow Cultivation team members that we have, which I think there's 7 of us now or something, which is pretty awesome. I can't sit here and say out of all the 60 facilities we've designed that I've got a perfect one. It's never perfect. And, you're just constantly tweaking and refining. But when you build out a full facility all at once, you make mistakes. And a lot of times you either can't fix them or can't afford to fix them and be down. And so you're kind of stuck with them. And, as an owner operator in the space, and you walk by that mistake every day, or there's some restriction, or there's something that is an injury, there's that bottleneck or that choke. It's a daily constant reminder that you screwed up.
Sure.
But with, if you phase out a project, right, you typically have 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 phase project is typical. They almost always have design changes in the second phases that are, from the lessons learned. And paper doesn't always translate well to ops.
Yeah. There's a lot of approaches in that space, but some people say, I want to have it and not need it. Right. So when you build out these rooms, yeah, it's a big ask, more connected electrical, more HVAC. I've seen people design rooms, build out one, optimize it, or build out 2, optimize them, and then look to the next 3 and 4 rooms and say, I can get away with 10 tons less of HVAC, this much less connected electrical. There's opportunities there to save a ton of money on the overall build out. And people think, I'll get to revenue, slower, but it's like, but when you get there, the efficiency of that last room you build is the perfect room. That's what you scale into now your next facility, because clearly you didn't learn it on the first one, right? But if you build out an entire facility with 10 rooms, like that was your one shot. Did you nail it? No. Like build it out in succession and you'll learn the genetics, the flow. Like I remember talking to you years ago, you brought up this concept of like tracking people's footsteps in the facility. So you know how far they had to go to get the scissors or the mop or to exit. Like there's
seconds matter.
There's days in there, days of travel time back and forth.
It was from Harborside. Once, Harborside was 5 acres of greenhouses, independent greenhouses. And my flower rooms were 1 acre wide open. There was no separation. This is my first time in a commercial greenhouse as an operator. I was more of an indoor guy, right?
Sure.
Coming from Colorado and vertical farming and all that stuff. But the way that the cards fell, I had the most qualifications of everybody in the room at the time. And nobody really wanted to take on the responsibility of remediating existing old greenhouses and trying to prep them from topiaries to cannabis with 9-foot gutters and raised benches. I mean, you had such a tight space to play with. But honestly, because of my experience in vertical farming, I said, all right, I've got like 6 feet from the trusses to the table. Like, all right, I'm going to grow like 3.5. I'm going to grow like a 4-foot tall plant. But if it wasn't for that, kind of vertical farming and like figuring out how to do things in a tight space, I don't know. I mean, it was still a pretty rough startup like most, but I looked at all of our labor and I was like, man, I got a lot of people and I had some of the best workers I've ever had the pleasure of working with. I mean, just incredible workforce available there in California from a full-time and like a temp staffing agency. Sure. That's one of the biggest strengths there for sure. But I remember, if I could eliminate 10 seconds or 10 steps that in a typical task where I'd have X amount of employees on doing defoliation or something, but if I could take 10 seconds or 10 steps out of that equation, it was 27 hours of savings. And I was like, oh my God. And it was California. I think we were paying, I don't know, I can't remember, $18 to $22,
Sure.
maybe $24 for some of the players that were in that greenhouse. And so all of a sudden it was like, wow, there's huge dollars tied to, wandering around and looking for things. One of the reasons that I got involved with podcasts is because I don't listen to a lot of them, to be honest with you, but I found a few early on where I really learned. And I was like, man, I work in this industry and I talk to these, experts all the time. And sometimes I pick up a couple little things, but like,
there's always a nugget.
Yeah. But like, there's a couple lean farming podcasts I listened to that really hit well for me. And it's like, it's not just for about cannabis. It applies to your life. And then I started going down the lean rabbit hole and I was like, oh, I kind of like this. I'm like a minimalist. So like when I think of like the perfect grow room, it doesn't have a lot of tchotchkes on the wall. It's like, it's exactly what you think. It's minimalist. It's like clean, sterile racking, lights, in-room air circulation, all the HVAC's where it needs to be. I might do some air sanitation stuff, but I want to walk in and you know exactly what it is and you know where everything is. I love shadow boards for that reason. You know, like everything has a place, and if it's missing, you know it right away.
Right.
I tend to use magnetic strips a lot in like post-harvest processing with scissors. Everything's eye level. Everything has a home and a purpose. And if it's not in your hand, it's not on the bench. I've seen so many sloppy practices with scissor handling, and they'll put it in substrate. You know, they're like, I don't know, we got this disease. You know, they're like,
Shoving in a used Rockwool block.
Look at your scissor handling practices. So I hate, at scale, I really hated when I'd pay people to wander around and go look for something. So I made sure that everybody had exactly what they needed for whatever that task was. But that ultralight packing and the survival of these cannabis facilities in the future in these consolidated markets, they need to lean up. They need to, like you were saying, like, you know, you take a little bit of risk and reward, but like get as light and nimble as you can and focus on absolutely necessary and not nice to have or comfortable or it makes me feel good, because there's a lot of waste in that mindset.
If you can't answer what is this solving and how much more money does it make, then you can't buy it, right? That's the key, in my opinion, right? Like, what am I solving for? What pain, what risk, what production ailment, what KPI am I solving for the delta? And how does it make me more money? If you can do that, then you're going to invest in this solution because it's going to make you more money and it's going to make you more lean. To me, that makes sense. But just like trying to chase the hot new thing because it's Instagrammable, or people want to see that trimmer in your space, or someone will give you something for free.
The free stuff is never free.
It's never free.
It's very expensive. It's I've just been burned enough over the years where I'm like, no, we won't be beta trialing. We're in startup mode. We're going to go with proven industry leading stuff that's already integrated, that we know has best practices associated with it. Like, I like that people always put an R&D facility in their spot, but it kind of is, it's a little hokey. It ends up being like pheno hunting or quarantine.
Sometimes it just ends up being like a tent in a room where you're like, oh, come on. Like, what level are we
Well,
at?
my issue is always like, well, like R&D sounds nice, like, but the word is research. And so like, what research are you doing? What data are you really gathering? You know, there's this issue in the cannabis industry, and a lot of it's because there's things like metric that are forced or mandated is probably the more nicer way to say that. And there's also all your internal tracking stuff. And so I see that the cannabis industry is capturing a boatload of data.
Sure.
But there's very few places that are taking the time to analyze it. You know, the typical leadership in cultivation, they're just trying to keep the ship afloat and moving in a direction. They're not like, oh, I'm going to crunch these numbers for 4 or 5 hours and build some beautiful spreadsheets and present them to, you know, it's like, it's pretty rare to see people actually harnessing the data outside of like, you know, substrate, moisture and stuff and water content. And
I was just going to say, like, there's all these tools that you can invest in that can help give you the granular data you need to make a better action plan. But if you don't know how to use that data, don't dedicate the labor to it because the cost is too high, right? Like, again, back to using the tools. There are great ones out there, but actually use them, collect the data and take action. Otherwise, like you were saying, like there really needs to be a dedicated person in every facility that's the data cruncher, right? They know what the outliers look like. They have expectations for the data and they can interpret the results, because you also need someone to grow the plants. And the faster you can interpret those results, the faster you can input the action plan to solve these problems, which again, reduces risks and keeps people afloat.
so I could talk to you forever, but I'm going to, with my last question for today, and I'm sure we'll have some more of these conversations. What are you excited for? And do you have any predictions for the future of multi-tiered cannabis? And also, I'd be curious on your thoughts on food crops.
Yeah, I think that there's this, fear in the market right now. And it's the perfect opportunity for operators that are not as risk averse to scale what they've done with multi-tier success, or to add a second tier now, go from single tier to multi-tier and take advantage of competition leaving the market. If you double down now and you get lean now, you'll get more market share tomorrow. And that market share is going to go up in value. The cannabis industry is not going anywhere. Real estate's getting more and more expensive. Markets are different geographically. So figure out where there's a lot of consumers and feed them really cool products, solve really cool problems. And I think that's the unseen thing when we talk about operational efficiency. It gets really heady in this CFO talk. Like, one of the beauties of it is that as a brand, you get to serve the customer better, throw cool parties, have cool giveaways. Like, I recently just talked to a woman who wants to take advantage of ecotourism with cannabis and food crops and bridging that knowledge gap, right? Get people that are really into a cannabis experience to also be able to come to a farm, and people that want to see a commercial farm also see cannabis farmed commercially. So there's these two hand in hand where who's feeding who, right? We had all this monetary opportunity for tech investment in cannabis, and we learned a lot. And now we see the commercial ag industry adopting some of it, not all of it, maybe going too far in certain cases. But again, like back to emissivity adjusted IR gun or anemometer, all these common tools to measure temperatures and airflow and things in the space are now common knowledge in lower level agricultural facilities.
Every cultivation facility should have a set of handheld tools, because unfortunately sensors and other technology get moved, disconnected.
Trust but verify.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And just that double, triple check. What's happening to my plants right now, right here.
Right. And at what level, and like, you really get to optimize, again, the lights, the racking, the fertigation, the drybacks, the nutrients, all those things are going to be a byproduct. The fine tuning is going to be a byproduct of your ability to collect the granular data and interpret it quickly. The faster you do that, the faster you put together a scalable SOP for commercial production, and now you can build more.
One of the first podcasts I did was at a place called Planet Detroit, and they are a non-cannabis, a CEA, microgreen, microflowers facility, and they're just they're pretty much in Detroit, but they're just kind of maybe just outside of Detroit a smidge. And it was so fascinating because during the podcast, one of the things they said is, well, I said, how'd you hear about Pipp? And they were like, oh, we saw from cannabis industry, and I'm so typical of there being like a green tax. So like if I want an agricultural product and I call them up historically and I'm like, I'm a cannabis farm, you're better off being like, no, I do basil, and then please give me I always say, please give me like typical agricultural pricing. Like
2% margin price.
Yeah, I don't need to pay twice as much because you think cannabis people are rich. What was interesting, what they said was, they said, because of the cannabis industry and the development and the demand, it drove down the price point for vertical farming equipment and made it more affordable for a non-cannabis farm to buy the equipment. And I thought that was pretty neat, because I'm not used to that. I'm used to their stuff, agricultural stuff, always being cheaper.
Sure.
And here's the cannabis industry helping non-cannabis CEA, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think there's a good exchange of back and forth information too, especially when we think about like IPM and environmental control and these really tight margins in commercial ag. Like, there's a lot to be learned from, is it worth it to invest in day-night differentials or particular IPM applications? What are the benefits? What's the cost analysis? Because when you only have 2% margin to be made in commercial ag, you'll figure out really quick what actually works. That's where the cannabis industry can come in and say, that's something that I really need to apply in my facility. And vice versa, we've seen the rise of vertical farming in tomatoes and strawberry runneries and, selling high level greens to airplanes and all these other things.
Yeah, Michelin star restaurants eat up this stuff, It's been really fascinating.
Part of it's the story of using the tool too, right? Like, do you use a particular light to bring out anthocyanin production? Like, is that more valuable to your consumer? Is it just a purple tiny leaf lettuce? Like, master your niche and do it the best and do it efficiently. And there's margins for sure.
Well, I'm excited about our new budding partnership. And if for people who are listening, where can they learn more about GrowGlide?
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate the opportunity to plug. So GrowGlide.com is my favorite place to send people, because that is a place where we can hide in a bunch of really good content, right? Like The resources page has our White Paper Wednesdays, it has our podcasts, and the room gen is there so you can take a tour of our solutions and really see plumbing, airflow, electrical, basic overview. But then you can also jump into the room gen, which is one of my favorite tools to play around with as a consultant. For years, like I would have to pay for services like that. And now I can just go in and get an order of magnitude on this canopy versus this canopy, and then play out the scenarios for the use of limited capital and say, with what we're looking at from a restrictions perspective, I think we should build 2,000 square foot canopy rooms versus these 3,500 because we'll actually be able to do it. And that to me was the revolution that was like, we can shorten the decision-making timeline down by 50%. Let's just get on the same page really quickly, pursue an A, B, and then it's yes or no, not 11th hour change orders and trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, I think the room configurator really was so helpful for people to really see what they're doing and bringing it to life. And I'm excited to get that implemented on the Pipp side.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah. All right, my brother. I appreciate you.
Appreciate you, Michael.
Yeah. Thanks for a good show.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to Cultivation Elevated. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at pipphorticulture.com/podcast. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/cultivation elevated. We'll be sure to read these out on future episodes.